An action method in a controller normally follows a simplified sequence to process a request. It receives a request and any associated data. It processes the request, usually with some kind of interaction with the model, and then generates a response to the user. Now, MVC applications support various levels of abstraction for generating a response to the user. At the lowest practical level, you can create an action method that uses the response object's methods, including write, redirect, transmit file, and others. Redirect and transmit file might be feasible to use in a real application, but you'd have to write a ton of code using the write method to generate even a simple web page for the user. So only use the response object when you absolutely need to, and you really rarely will, but there are better ways within MVC. An action method can return three broad types of results to the user. The first is the response can consist of HTML that displays a full or partial web page to the user by rendering a view. This is probably the most common response that your action methods are going to produce. The response can redirect the browser to another action method or to a page, including a fixed page such as an ASPX web form page. In this case, the application issues an HTTP redirection, which causes the address in the browser's address bar to update as well. And then finally, the response can contain a chunk of data for the browser, such as binary data or JSON data. In this case, it injects the data into the response's output stream. And there are many possible variations of these three broad types of results. But what they all have in common is that the action method can return an action result, any of several objects that are able to send various kinds of responses to the users. All of these action results are objects that derive from the action result base class. This class has a very simple definition, and this is code from the system.web.mvc source code that you can download from Microsoft. As you can see, the class contains a single method, executeResult, which receives a controller context object with information about the desired result. An action result object takes care of the low-level work of generating the response. Once you've written the custom code that implements your application logic. It's a nice separation of framework-level infrastructure code from the custom code within your application. MVC provides a number of different action result types. These derive directly or indirectly from the action result base class. You usually don't have to instantiate those objects directly, those objects that are listed in the type column, the first column within the table. Instead, the controller class includes a number of helper methods that simplify your code, and that's the second column within the table. So you can use the content result to return raw textual data to the browser, including things like strings, XML, comma-separated values, or whatever. The empty result is just that. It returns nothing to the browser. The file result is an abstract base class for sending a file to the browser. The derived classes from this action result can send the file, the contents of the file, or a file stream back to the browser. The HTTP unauthorized result returns an HTTP 401 unauthorized status error as a result of an unauthorized HTTP request. You can use this action result when the user requests some page that they're not authorized to see. You can also use a JavaScript result. This literally returns JavaScript commands to the browser, which is usually in response to an AJAX request from the browser. It injects that JavaScript into the response stream. You can use the JSON result object in order to return JavaScript object notation data, which is a lightweight textual data format. As you develop more complex web applications using MVC, you'll probably use the partial view result quite a bit. This is similar to the view result, but it sends a snippet of HTML rather than a full page, again usually in response to an AJAX request. The redirect result redirects the user to another URL, and it uses an HTTP 302 status code in order to do that redirection. You can also redirect to a route result, And there's actually a couple helper methods associated with that result: the redirect to route and redirect to action. The redirect to route allows you to use the name of a route that you've defined within the global file in order to redirect the user to a specific location. And then you can also redirect the user to a specific action method. And then finally, the view result action result type returns a full HTML web page to the user. And that's probably the result type that you'll use most often. As a user navigates around your website, you'll present them with new pages full of interesting information and entertainment. I'm not going to cover views in depth here, but the views you define will be in the form of an ASPX file full of HTML and code that binds to or uses data provided by the action result, usually from a model. So let's take a look at how you can use some of these action result types. Here's the About Action method within the Home controller. This is probably the simplest possible action method that you could write. It uses the View helper method for the view result to return the default view for the action method, which is defined in Views Home About.aspx. Because the view definition is in the Home directory is the same name as the action method, you don't even have to specify the view name. Now, the About view in the sample application consists of just static text, so the action method doesn't have to touch the model or provide any additional data in order to display the view. So it keeps things very, very simple. But the View method of the controller class has several overloads for specifying which view to display, as well as options how to bind the view to model or other data. You can even specify the master page to use with this instance of the view. For example, you could write the About Action method like this. In this case, what it's doing is it's explicitly passing in the name of the view that you want. Now, this is redundant and extra work because this is the view that it's going to request, because the first choice is to look for a view with the same name as the action method. But you can do it this way. When this technique becomes valuable is if you actually need to display a different view. Maybe you have different view files, ASPX files, that you can use with a single action method. In that case, if it's called anything but About, you need to specify the name of the view. Now, both of these About Action methods return an action result object. But in reality, View returns an object of type ViewResult. But because ViewResult, like all action result objects, are derived from action result, then this code is correct and works. But if you want to follow good object-oriented coding techniques, you really should indicate the specific type that's returned from an action method, unless you really are going to return various types of objects that derive from action result. So a better way to write this method is like this. In this case, what you're doing is you're specifying that you're returning an object of type ViewResult. But that's not necessary, and in fact, when you create a lot of the pages using the Visual Studio tools, it'll just plug in action result as the generic result type. So you can go either way. All right, let me comment these out again and talk a little bit about finding the appropriate view. In order to find the view, when you don't explicitly specify a location in the View method call, the View engine is going to look in several locations within the project in a specific order, and they're listed here. But over in Solution Explorer, it's going to look within the Views folder, the name of the controller, so in this case it's the Home controller, so it's going to look within the Home controllers section, and it's going to look for an object named the same as the action method with an ASPX extension. So in this case, it's going to look for the about.aspx file. If it doesn't find that, it's going to look for a file with the name about.ascx. Then, if it doesn't find that, it's going to look in the shared folder for the about.aspx file. Doesn't find that, it's going to look for about.ascx. So that's the gauntlet that it runs in order to find the appropriate view. It's easiest and cleanest to place the views in the standard locations. because this takes advantage of the convention over configuration and lets you write simpler code, such as just calling the viewHelper method without any parameters at all. But if you really need to locate the view definition outside of those specified locations, then you can specify the path to the file that contains the view definition. So for example, this is yet another way to write that same action method. So here I'm specifying the explicit location of that file. In this particular case, it's the actual location uses the standard locations, but I can use the same sort of path information if it's not located, for example, within the views folder. So I'm going to use the tilde in order to reference the root folder of this application, and then specify whatever the path is. Now it's important to understand that using this notation, I have to specify the ASPX extension. The reason is because when I use this technique, I'm bypassing the view engine's normal lookup mechanism, so it doesn't add the extension for us. And in this path, you can specify either an absolute path, as I basically have done here, or a relative path. If you want to use a relative path without a tilde, then it's relative to the usual location where MVC looks for the view, which is going to be within that views folder. All right, so let's talk a little bit more now about passing data to the view. The mechanism used for passing data from a controller to a view is the viewData class. And this class works a little bit like the ASP.NET Session object in that it exposes a dictionary object, specifically a viewData dictionary. And that's available both to the controller and to the view. The difference between viewData and Session is that viewData is available only until the code renders the view. Then it goes away. But Session is available for the duration of the user's interaction with the website until the session either expires or you explicitly abandon the session by calling the abandon method. ViewData is fairly flexible. You can use it either as a loosely typed dictionary or as a way to pass a strongly typed object that you bind the view to. Even though the code you've seen so far hasn't explicitly used ViewData all that much, it's been at work behind the scenes. So let's go up to the index method of the home controller. Seen this before? This is where it uses the message object to assign a string, and then that string is going to be displayed within the view. Now because this is using a data dictionary notation, you can also use the add method in order to add that object. So I pass in the name of the object as the first parameter, and then the string that I want to use to assign to that value as the second parameter. Now let's take a look at the view that uses that data. And it's right there. So what this is doing is it's using ViewData to read that message object. That returns that string value. It HTML encodes that value and then displays it within an H2 element. Now ViewData has a model property that you can use to specify the model that the view is going to be bound to. I'll go over to the dog controller and the edit method. And here's an example of that. By passing that object as a parameter to the view, MVC is going to assign that D object that represents a dog object. It's going to assign that object to the model property of ViewData. That's one way of doing it, and it's the easiest way. But you can also explicitly use the model property. And here's code that does that. So it's using the model property, assigning that D object to it. And in this case, the D object is already assigned to the model, so I don't need to pass it as a parameter to the view. And this is the explicit way of assigning that object to the model. Now, no matter whether you implicitly or explicitly set the model property, the view is going to have access to a strongly typed object it can use to display the data to the user. And we've seen examples of where you can use Lambda expressions within the view in order to display the data and make it available to the user. The really nice thing is that you can combine both the loosely and strongly typed approaches in the same action method. So you can use a strongly typed model as well as assign name-value pairs to the view data dictionary. And that means that you can use a strongly typed model for the bulk of the data needed by the view, as well as add one or many more loosely typed objects to the view data dictionary. And then everything is going to be available to the view. All right, so that's the view result. Let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about the content result. Now, although HTML is by far the dominant data format of the web, modern browsers can deal with a wide variety of other data formats, including things like XML and variations like RSS for news feeds, comma-separated values, plain old text, and lots of others. When you need to send this kind of data to the browser as an action result, you can use a content result object, or its helper method, content. In that case, you need to specify the content data as a string, and then optionally specify the content type and its encoding. If you don't specify either of those optional parameters, the method uses the corresponding setting for the current response object. Let's go back over to the home controller. Go down to the plain text action method. So here's a simple example of using the content result. It uses the context action method to pass a string, in this case just a simple string that will be displayed within the browser, and I'm specifying a content type of text plain. So this way the browser will know what to do with this string. Now a little bit more interesting example is this getXML action method. What this does is it uses a content result in order to return some XML to the browser. In this case, I have very simple XML, and I'm specifying the XML text format. So the browser is going to know what to do with this data. I'll go ahead and run the application, and I'll first click on the plain text link here. And so as you can see, it just displays this plain text string. This is the content result. And if I look at the page source, you can see that literally that's all it is. There's no HTML, there's nothing else behind there. So that's that content result. And I'll go back now and click on the XML link. And as you can see, I have XML. Because Internet Explorer knows what to do with XML data, I can hook into these features where I can expand and collapse nodes. And if I look at the source behind that page, literally it's just XML. Now, if you need to return plain text and don't need to specify the content type, you can create an action method that returns any kind of object. This is kind of a cool feature in MVC where it just basically does the right thing for you. If the return value is not a string, then MVC will convert it to a string using the toString method. And it'll use an invariant culture setting with the default content type for the current response object. Then it wraps that resulting string in a content result object and uses that internally to send it back to the user. This is called an implicit action result. Just keep in mind that if you need to specify any other content type, explicitly specify it, then you'll need to either return a content result object or use the content method explicitly. So here's an example of using that technique. The getGUID action method returns a GUID object. So the code news up a GUID object and then just directly returns that. So this isn't an action result type. And so MVC is going to convert that to a string and then wrap it in a content result object. If I run the application and click on the GUID link here, you can see that it displays that literal string. And I'll view the source, and again, it's just a literal string. Now, the examples I've shown you using the content result object show the string as the entire content sent to the browser. But you can also use content result to inject strings of the various data formats into a page. For example, you could make an AJAX request to an action method and use the string response to update a portion of the page. But what if the action method returns a null, or just doesn't return anything? In the case of null, the action invoker replaces the result with an instance of empty result, which is another action result type. And returning a null is consistent with the null object pattern, one of the common patterns used in software development. If the action method doesn't return any result, the action invoker treats it as though it returned null and again replaces the result with an empty result. So it's up to you whether you want to use implicit or explicit action results. Some people think that using an implicit action result makes the code clearer because the method signature better identifies the intention of the code, rather than obscuring it with an action result object. Using the actual object return type almost makes the code a little easier to test using automated methods as well. Now let's talk about the JavaScript result, which is one of the more interesting results that you can send back from a controller. This result type is useful for use with AJAX to insert and execute JavaScript code as a result of some user action. The JavaScript result does pretty much the same thing as content result. It returns a string to the browser. But in this case, it's going to set the content type to application/x-JavaScript. And here's an example of that. The insert.js action method is going to return this JavaScript result object. It creates a string with JavaScript code that's going to pop up an alert. And then it uses the JavaScript helper method in order to return that string. So I'll go ahead and run this and click on the Run JavaScript, and it pops up that dialog box. Now what's interesting here is that if the user had JavaScript turned off within the browser for this website, or completely turned off, this string will be displayed within the page as a literal string. So it degrades gracefully. It's kind of an ugly degradation, but it does degrade, and the user at least gets the message. Let's take a look at the view and the action link that causes that to happen. In this case, it's an action link of the AJAX object. This is one of the objects that's provided by the view page object for an MVC view. Here's the text that appears on the page. It calls that action method that's within the home controller. In order to get the correct action link overload, also pass in a null for the optional parameters. Now running this code requires that the page reference the Microsoft Ajax.js file, or in this case the debug version of them, as well as the Microsoft MVC Ajax code. This is what enables the use of this Ajax object. Now more often you'll use this technique in order to make some sort of dynamic change to the web page. And here's an example of that. The update page action method again returns a JavaScript result, and it uses this JavaScript. It's going to inject that JavaScript into the page. And what it's doing here is it's using the jQuery object in order to get a reference to a span element, and it's going to insert some HTML code, specifically this string. If we go back over to the index method, here's the action link for that action method. Once again, the text that's going to be displayed, calling that action method of the home controller. And here's the span element that is going to be updated with the return value of that action method. Go ahead and run the application, scroll down, and click on the update page. And as you can see, the page was updated with that information.